Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7, 1941. Dawn breaks quietly over Battleship Row. The harbor is calm, the water barely moves. Steel hulls rest side by side, their reflections stretched across the surface like shadows frozen in time. At 7:55 a.m., the calm shatters. Japanese aircraft burst through the clouds, torpedoes slice into the water, bombs fall with mechanical precision. Within minutes, the USS West Virginia is hit again and again, 7 torpedoes tearing into her port side, bombs punching through decks already ablaze. Fires spread, smoke blinds the bridge, orders are shouted, then swallowed by explosions. Slowly, inevitably, the battleship begins to settle. Not capsizing, not breaking apart, but sinking straight down into the shallow mud of Pearl Harbor. By mid-morning, her decks are awash, her superstructure still visible, but her heart drowned. Inside the hull, trapped sailors tap desperately against steel that will never answer. By nightfall, West Virginia is silent. To many, she is finished. A total loss. A steel grave beneath the oil-stained water. Yet even as the smoke clears, a question lingers in the harbor air, whether this ship is truly dead or merely waiting. The World on the Edge, 1941. By the final months of 1941, the world was already burning. In Europe, Nazi Germany had overrun Poland, crushed France, and driven deep into the Soviet Union. Britain stood battered but unbroken. The Atlantic was a killing ground where U-boats stalked convoys with ruthless efficiency. Every major power understood that this was no longer a regional war. It was global, industrial, and total. In the Pacific, tension had been building for years. Japan, an island nation with limited natural resources, had embarked on a campaign of expansion across East Asia. Manchuria in 1931, full-scale war with China by 1937. By 1940, Japanese forces occupied large portions of China and had moved into French Indochina. Oil, steel, and rubber, materials essential for modern war, were running short. The United States, alarmed by Japanese aggression, responded with economic pressure. In July 1941, Washington froze Japanese assets. Soon after, oil exports to Japan were cut off almost entirely. For Tokyo, this was not merely an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. Japanese military planners calculated that without access to oil, their navy would be immobilized within 2 years, perhaps less. Diplomacy continued, but preparations for war accelerated. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed that if conflict with the United States was inevitable, it had to begin with a decisive blow, one that would cripple American naval power long enough for Japan to seize and fortify a vast defensive perimeter across the Pacific. At the heart of American power in the region lay the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Since 1940, it had been stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, a forward base meant to deter Japanese expansion. Battleships were its backbone. Massive, heavily armored, armed with 14 and 16-inch guns, they represented decades of naval doctrine. To sink an enemy battleship was to erase years of industrial effort and strategic planning. American leadership believed Pearl Harbor to be relatively secure. The harbor was shallow. Torpedo attacks were considered unlikely. Battleships were moored in neat rows along Ford Island, convenient, visible, and dangerously predictable. Japanese planners saw this clearly. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, authorized a bold and risky plan, a carrier-based surprise attack across 3,500 miles of ocean. Specially modified torpedoes were designed to run in shallow water. Pilots trained relentlessly. Timing, weather, and secrecy became obsessions. On December 7, 1941, that plan unfolded with devastating effect. Within 2 hours, much of Battleship Row lay wrecked or burning. The USS Arizona exploded with catastrophic loss of life. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds inside. Others were damaged, beached, or sunk at their moorings. Among them was the USS West Virginia. When the attack ended, American commanders faced a grim assessment. The Pacific Fleet's battleship force appeared shattered. Salvage seemed uncertain. Some ships were already written off as beyond recovery. Yet even amid destruction, the United States possessed something Japan underestimated: industrial depth, engineering expertise, and a willingness to rebuild what seemed irretrievably lost. And nowhere would that resolve be tested more severely than with the silent hull resting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The ship, the doctrine, and the decision. The USS West Virginia was not an experimental vessel, nor a marginal one. Commissioned in December 1923, she was a Colorado-class battleship, the last and most powerful class of American standard-type battleships built after World War I, designed for line-of-battle engagements. She embodied the naval thinking of her era: slow but heavily armored, capable of delivering devastating broadsides while absorbing punishment that would cripple lesser ships. She displaced over 32,000 tons, fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 8 16-inch guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, among the largest naval rifles in the world at the time. Thick armor belts protected her vitals. Multiple watertight compartments were meant to contain flooding. Her crew numbered more than 1,400 officers and enlisted men. By 1941, West Virginia had become a familiar presence in the Pacific Fleet. She participated in fleet exercises, gunnery training, and readiness drills designed around one central assumption: if war came, battleships would still decide it. On the morning of December 7, she lay moored along Battleship Row, inboard of the USS Tennessee. This positioning would shape her fate. As Japanese torpedoes struck, West Virginia absorbed at least 7 confirmed hits along her port side. The explosions ripped open fuel tanks and voids, tearing through multiple compartments. 2 armor-piercing bombs followed, igniting fires that raged for days. Yet the ship did not capsize. Her crew, acting under intense pressure, executed a critical decision: counter-flooding. By deliberately flooding compartments on the opposite side, they prevented the battleship from rolling over like Oklahoma. The ship sank evenly, settling upright into the harbor bottom. Water rose to the main deck. Flames scorched her superstructure. Oil burned across the surface above her. From above, she looked like a wreck. From below, she was worse. The harbor floor was thick with mud. Silt poured into ruptured compartments. Debris, fuel oil, and twisted steel sealed interior spaces. For days after the attack, faint tapping sounds were reportedly heard from within the hull, trapped sailors attempting to signal rescuers. Despite desperate efforts, time ran out. 66 crewmen would die aboard West Virginia. In the immediate aftermath, Navy officials categorized the ship as a total loss. The damage appeared too extensive. The hull was torn open. Fires had warped internal structures. Electrical systems were destroyed. Some officers argued that resources would be better spent on newer ships and aircraft carriers, which were increasingly seen as the future of naval warfare. But others saw something different. Because West Virginia had sunk upright, because her keel remained intact, because Pearl Harbor's shallow depth prevented her from disappearing completely beneath the water, the possibility, however remote, remained. Salvage engineers examined her damage. Divers mapped the hull. Calculations were made. It would be slow. It would be dangerous. It would require techniques never attempted on a battleship this size. Yet by early 1942, the U.S. Navy made a decision that would redefine the ship's fate. West Virginia would not be abandoned. And with that choice, the story shifted from loss to effort to something far more uncertain: resurrection. For the crew of the USS West Virginia, the attack on Pearl Harbor did not end when the bombs stopped falling. Below decks, in compartments sealed by fire and flooding, dozens of sailors were trapped in darkness. The ship's internal layout, normally a safeguard, became a maze with no exits. Thick smoke consumed oxygen. Rising water cut off escape routes. Some men survived for hours, possibly days, tapping on steel bulkheads in desperate attempts to signal their presence. Rescue teams worked tirelessly, cutting into the hull where they could. but fires burned above, and the risk of flooding the entire ship increased with every attempt. By the time the ship was stabilized, it was too late. When West Virginia was later raised, rescuers would find evidence of men who had rationed air, water, and hope, grim reminders that ships are not just machines, but communities sealed within steel. The Japanese torpedoes that struck West Virginia were Type 91 aerial torpedoes, modified with wooden fins to stabilize them in shallow water. Each carried a warhead capable of rupturing heavy armor. 7 impacts along one side should have doomed the ship outright, yet her design, thick internal subdivision, armored torpedo defense systems, and rapid damage control kept her from capsizing. Counterflooding was not a desperate gamble, it was doctrine drilled into the crew through years of training. The result was paradoxical. West Virginia was destroyed, but in a way that made survival possible. Moored inboard, West Virginia could not maneuver. Her anti-aircraft defenses were unprepared. Ammunition lockers were locked. Aircraft came in low and fast, exploiting blind spots. This was not a failure of courage or competence. It was a failure of assumptions. The battleship, once the queen of naval warfare, had been caught immobile by a new form of attack, one that cared little for armor thickness or gun caliber. And as West Virginia settled into the harbor mud, she became a symbol of that moment when doctrine collided with reality. Yet even in defeat, the ship's structure and the decisions made aboard her preserved something essential. Not victory, but possibility. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy faced choices shaped by urgency and uncertainty. Resources were finite, dry docks were damaged. The Pacific demanded immediate action. Some voices argued that ships like West Virginia were relics, too slow, too damaged, too costly to restore. But others, including Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, saw salvage as more than repair. It was a statement. To raise a battleship sunk in the opening blow of the war was to signal resilience to allies, to enemies, and to American crews who would fight for years to come. Nimitz authorized extensive salvage operations, not only for West Virginia, but for nearly every damaged vessel at Pearl Harbor. It was a bet on American engineering and industrial endurance. Salvaging West Virginia required unprecedented precision. Divers worked in zero visibility, sealing massive hull breaches with steel plates and concrete. Fires had twisted bulkheads. Oil coated every surface. Internal spaces were toxic. Cofferdams were constructed to isolate damaged sections. Water was pumped out gradually, balancing internal pressure to prevent structural collapse. The ship had to be raised inch by inch, her own weight constantly threatening to tear her apart. When she finally refloated in May 1942, the sight was both triumphant and sobering. The ship was alive, but wounded beyond anything a simple repair could fix. From the Japanese perspective, Pearl Harbor was meant to remove American battleships from the war permanently. Initial reports claimed overwhelming success. Battleships were sunk, the harbor was burning, the Pacific Fleet appeared crippled. What Japanese planners underestimated was salvage. They assumed that a sunken battleship was a dead battleship. They did not fully grasp the United States' ability to recover, rebuild, and adapt. In this, West Virginia became an unintentional lesson, one Japan would not fully understand until it was too late. As the ship was towed away for reconstruction, her future was no longer theoretical. She was going to return. And when she did, it would not be as the ship she once was. Raising the dead at Pearl Harbor. The salvage of the USS West Virginia was not a single moment of triumph. It was a prolonged confrontation with physics, fatigue, and the consequences of war. Divers descended into black water thick with fuel oil and silt. Visibility was measured in inches. Every movement stirred clouds of mud that swallowed light. Inside the hull, temperatures fluctuated. Oxygen was scarce. Structural integrity was uncertain. One miscalculation could collapse a bulkhead and trap men inside. Hull breaches, some wider than a truck, had to be sealed from the outside. Steel plates were bolted and welded in place underwater. Concrete was poured to reinforce weak points. The ship's internal spaces were methodically searched, compartment by compartment. It was during these searches that the human cost became undeniable. Remains of crew members were found where they had fallen. In one compartment, 3 sailors were discovered beside an improvised calendar scratched into a bulkhead, evidence they had survived for days after the attack. These discoveries halted work repeatedly as recovery teams paused to honor the dead before continuing. By early 1942, the ship was stabilized enough to begin deutering. Pumps ran continuously, forcing thousands of tons of seawater from her interior. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, West Virginia began to rise. On May 17, 1942, the battleship floated again. She was towed to dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor, her hull streaked with rust and oil, her superstructure burned and broken. What emerged was not a warship ready for battle, but a framework, a skeleton demanding reinvention. Inspection revealed the full extent of the damage. Frames were bent, decks were warped, machinery was ruined. It was clear that returning West Virginia to her pre-war configuration made little sense. If she was to live again, she would be reborn. And that decision, to rebuild rather than merely repair, marked the true turning point of her story. Reforged for a new war. After emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor, USS West Virginia was sent across the Pacific to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. The journey itself was symbolic. A ship once declared lost, now crossing open ocean under her own power, escorted but alive. What awaited her was not restoration in the traditional sense. The U.S. Navy no longer intended to fight the next battles with the assumptions of the last. The war had already proven that air power, radar, and anti-aircraft defense were decisive. If West Virginia was to return, she would do so as a different kind of battleship. Between 1942 and 1944, her superstructure was almost entirely rebuilt. Her tall cage masts, icons of an earlier era, were removed and replaced with a compact tower structure designed to support modern fire control systems. Radar arrays were installed, giving her eyes far beyond the horizon and the ability to fight at night. Her anti-aircraft armament was transformed. Dozens of 14 Bofors and 20 Oerlikon guns lined her decks, replacing outdated weapons. Fire control directors linked gunners to radar and optical systems, creating layered defensive zones against aircraft. Internal compartments were redesigned for improved damage control and crew safety. Her armor was reinforced, her hull strengthened, her propulsion systems overhauled. By the time she emerged from the yard in July 1944, West Virginia was no longer a relic rescued from the mud. She was among the most modernized battleships in the U.S. Navy. And she was heading back to war. In the autumn of 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, the rebuilt battleship joined Task Force 77. Her guns, silent since Pearl Harbor, would soon speak again. The moment of reckoning came in the narrow waters of the Philippines, a place called Surigao Strait. There, under cover of darkness and guided by radar, West Virginia would confront the enemy that had once left her for dead. Return to battle, revenge at Surigao Strait. October 25, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had begun, the largest naval engagement of World War II, and possibly the largest in human history. Among its many theaters, the narrow waters of Surigao Strait became a proving ground for old doctrines and new technology alike. USS West Virginia, fully modernized and fully crewed, was positioned as part of Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf's battle line. Her 16-inch guns, once silent under mud and fire, now stood ready. Radar-guided fire control systems gave her an advantage her original crew in 1941 could never have imagined. Anti-aircraft batteries bristled along her decks. She was no longer a passive target, she was a predator. As Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers funneled into the strait under cover of night, the Americans lay in wait. Torpedo attacks and preliminary engagements from PT boats and destroyers had already slowed the enemy advance. The stage was set for one of the most decisive moments in naval history. At 03:51, the first salvos from the American battleships lit the water with explosive fire. West Virginia fired along with her sister ships, delivering broadsides guided by radar rather than sight alone. She scored hits that would cripple Japanese vessels before they could bring their guns to bear effectively. The irony was stark. The very ship that had been deemed irrecoverable, sunk by the enemy, and left to rot beneath the harbor mud, now contributed decisively to their destruction. Japanese commanders had assumed West Virginia would never sail again. They were wrong. Over the course of the night, the battle line destroyed the Japanese southern force. West Virginia fired hundreds of rounds, each shot a testament to industrial recovery, human resilience, and tactical evolution. Her crew, some of whom were veterans of Pearl Harbor, witnessed history repeating itself, but this time in their favor. When dawn broke, the waters of Surigao Strait were littered with wreckage. The southern force had been annihilated. West Virginia survived, unscathed and triumphant, a steel phoenix risen from the ashes of her own sinking. The significance extended beyond the battlefield. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of modernized battleships, the integration of radar-guided fire, and the U.S. Navy's ability to adapt and innovate under pressure. Legacy of survival and symbolism. The USS West Virginia's journey did not end with Surigao Strait. Her survival and combat effectiveness became emblematic of the United States' industrial might and commitment to perseverance. In numbers alone, the ship had endured. Casualties at Pearl Harbor, 66 lost. Guns fired at Surigao Strait, hundreds of 16-inch shells. Damage inflicted on enemy vessels, multiple confirmed hits, contributing to the sinking of Japanese battleships and cruisers. But beyond statistics, her return carried psychological weight. Sailors across the Pacific, knowing that a ship once sunk by enemy torpedoes and bombs could return to fight, found renewed confidence in their leadership and the Navy's capabilities. The ship itself became a living memorial to the sacrifices of December 7, 1941, a reminder that loss could transform into opportunity and destruction into renewal. The Navy's decision to rebuild West Virginia also shaped doctrine. Salvage operations demonstrated that even heavily damaged capital ships could be recovered, modernized, and returned to frontline service. Engineers refined techniques that would influence future ship restorations, damage control protocols, and maintenance planning. Naval historians note that such projects accelerated the integration of new technologies, particularly radar, anti-aircraft armament, and crew safety measures. Enemy assessments, captured after the war, reflected disbelief. Japanese strategists had counted on removing West Virginia permanently. Her return challenged assumptions about American recovery, resilience, and the capacity to turn setbacks into decisive victories. The ship's participation at Leyte Gulf and subsequent engagements illustrated that modern warfare demanded not just superior firepower, but the ability to adapt, rebuild, and innovate under pressure. By 1947, West Virginia had served in multiple campaigns, earning 5 battle stars for her contributions. She became a symbol of hope, engineering ingenuity, and the unbreakable spirit of those who served aboard her. Reports from surviving crew members emphasize pride not merely in the ship's firepower, but in what her restoration represented, humanity's ability to reclaim what was thought lost. Her story transitioned from tactical achievement to historical emblem. West Virginia's resurrection demonstrated that even in war, ingenuity and determination could rewrite outcomes once assumed final. The battleship had survived the most lethal surprise attack in U.S. naval history and returned stronger, more capable, and more symbolic than ever. Steel, time, and the human spirit. The story of USS West Virginia is more than the account of a ship sunk and raised. It is a meditation on resilience, of steel, of strategy, and of the human spirit. Beneath the harbor's waters, she lay silent for months, a victim of sudden violence and unforeseen calamity. Yet her final rest was not permanent. Through careful planning, relentless labor, and unwavering belief in possibility, she rose again, transformed by human ingenuity. Her resurrection reminds us that destruction is rarely absolute. In war, in life, in history, there is always the potential for renewal, for adaptation, for reclamation. Engineers, sailors, and leaders worked in tandem, each decision building upon another, proving that patience and precision can overturn even the most catastrophic losses. Moreover, West Virginia's story illuminates the interplay of technology and human will. Radar, anti-aircraft weapons, reinforced hulls, these innovations were vital, but they were meaningless without courage, expertise, and determination. The ship became a nexus of history, where machinery and humanity intersected to rewrite a fate that seemed sealed beneath the ocean floor. 80 years later, her story endures not simply in record books or battle stars, but as a narrative of hope. It tells us that what is lost is not necessarily gone, that with vision, skill, and relentless effort, even what seems destroyed can return, sometimes stronger, sometimes wiser, always carrying memory and meaning. And in the silence of the harbor where she first sank, one can still imagine her rising from the depths, a testament to resilience, a reminder that even the deepest losses may conceal the seeds of extraordinary recovery.